Hey folks, we're gonna start here in a minute as people join. Hope everybody's having a good evening tonight. We appreciate your attendance and attention as more folks join us here. We'll get started here in just 1 minute. All right, we're 1 minute in. So welcome everybody. My name is Matt Ross. I'm the Director of Conservation for the National Deer Association. I'm actually pinch hitting tonight for our CEO, Nick Pinizzato, who's been hosting these meetings. So I'll be playing moderator. We're in for a good program. This is actually one of 6 webinars that we're holding across the state of Pennsylvania. Of course, tonight we're in the Northwest region, but we've held them in other regions and will continue to into next week. Certainly not a fun topic, but we're here to talk about chronic wasting disease. But it's a critically important topic, especially if you care about deer. And I think anybody that's taken time out of their schedule to join us to listen for an hour, a little over an hour on CWD and what's going on, cares about deer. So we'll have several speakers. Let me talk to you about who will be joining us. First, we're going to start local there in the Northwest region. We're going to have Roger Kaup, who is the Northwest Region Wildlife Management Supervisor with the Pennsylvania Game Commission. Following Roger will be Brian Richards. Brian's going to give us a national perspective of what's going on with chronic wasting disease. Brian's a wildlife biologist as well, the emerging disease coordinator, and works for the National Wildlife Health Center. Follow that, my colleague, Kip Adams. Kip is the Chief Conservation Officer here at the National Deer Association. Kip is a Pennsylvania native, and following Kip will be Andrea Corman, who will talk about chronic wasting disease from the Pennsylvania Game Commission. She is a biologist and the CWD coordinator, and talk about what the PGC is doing and has been doing to help manage and slow the spread of this really terrible disease. We also have Scott Weber joining us on the panel. Scott is the communications liaison and senior research investigator with Wildlife Futures, which is a partnership between Pennsylvania Game Commission and the University of Pennsylvania, specifically Penn Vet. So in a minute, I'll let Roger start. Just for folks to know, we're going to be recording, or we are recording this. So after it's done, if you want to return to watch it, you'll be able to do that. I'll announce where that will be hosted later. And if any question pops up throughout the presentations, look for the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen. And at any point, you can type a question in there. It'll house it, and we're going to address all those at the end. And there's also the chat feature as well. So thank you again for joining us. I'm going to turn over the mic to Roger to give us his introduction on what's going on in the Northwest region with chronic wasting disease. So Roger, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you, Matt. As Matt said, I'm the Wildlife Management Supervisor here in the Northwest region. And before I do my regional update on CWD, I'd just like to give you folks kind of an introduction of CWD in case you're not familiar with it. The other speakers are going to go into more detail, but I'll give you a brief introduction of it. So let me get my screen up here and make sure everything works right. And can you see my screen, Matt, or anyone that can hear? Is you seeing the screen properly?
Not quite yet, Roger, but we'll, I'm sure it take a second.
Give me just a second here.
Sure.
You make sure that it hits share. I had to select share screen again.
Okay, something is coming up. I can see the presentation, but it's still not in the view of full screen.
Okay. Get this here.
There you go.
How's that look?
It's actually still in the same view.
Still in the notes? Okay,
Yeah.
let me switch it.
There you go.
All
You're
right,
good.
now we're good to go. Okay. All right. Chronic wasting disease is definitely a threat to our deer and elk here in Pennsylvania. And just very quickly about it, it's a disease that is always fatal to members of the deer family. There's no vaccine or treatment for it. It's not caused by any living organism like a virus or bacteria. It's caused by an abnormal piece of protein called a prion. And looks can be deceiving when it comes to CWD. It has a very long incubation period, about 18 to 24 months before a deer starts to show symptoms. So they can be shedding prions into the environment during that time before they even look sick. And an example, these two pictures are an example. The deer on the right is one we'd consider a classic CWD suspect. It's emaciated and wasted, and that would be a suspect. The one on the left looks perfectly healthy, but it could be positive for CWD and shedding prions in the environment. So when it comes to chronic wasting disease, you can't go by how a deer looks to know if it has CWD or not. It can be transmitted both directly and indirectly, directly by deer-to-deer contact and indirectly by the prions being shed in the environment by deer that aren't even showing symptoms yet. As far as monitoring for CWD across Pennsylvania, we sample hunter harvested deer. We collect deer heads in bins, head collection bins during hunting season. Hunters can drop their heads in the bins. We collect those heads and sample them. We also run extraction stations during a portion of the deer season to randomly sample deer from across the state. And then we also sample roadkill deer, and we often get samples from roadkill deer in areas where we don't have much hunting pressure and we would not otherwise get very many samples. And the other deer that we sample are suspects, like that wasted deer I just showed you, and some others. For example, an escapee. This would be a deer perhaps harvested by someone that turns out to have ear tags. That tells us that it was is an escapee from a captive facility. So we always sample those to make sure that we determine if they're positive or negative. Here in the Northwest region, we have 10 counties, and most of Jefferson and a little bit of Clarion County is in Disease Management Area 3, or DMA 3. We first confirmed CWD in a captive facility in Jefferson County in 2014, and DMA 3 was formed in response to that positive deer. And since then, the DMA has expanded with additional positives in Jefferson County and other counties surrounding us. And on the map, the red markers are positive wild deer that we've had in Jefferson County, either roadkills or hunter harvested. And the two stars are two captive facilities, the original facility we had and a second facility that tested positive for CWD. I mentioned the head bins. This is an example of one of those. Hunters can drop their heads in there. We collect heads from the bins every day during hunting season and sample them and send results to hunters. Last hunting season, we had 9 head bins in Jefferson County in DMA 3. We collected 403 heads during that hunting season, and the vast majority from Jefferson County. As I said, Clarion is just a small portion of the DMA. As far as the head bins, the green markers on the slide are head bin locations in Jefferson County. We don't expect that to change for this coming hunting season unless we have any additional positives between now and then and have to add any additional head bins. I mentioned the extraction stations we run statewide in different areas during the firearms portion of the deer season. We have deer aging teams that randomly collect samples from processors across the state and within our regions, and that gives us a sample from within the entire region. Here in the Northwest, we had 687 samples, processor samples, and 157 of those were from our DMA counties, mainly, again, Jefferson County. I mentioned we sample roadkill deer. We sample roadkills within the DMA and also in the townships surrounding the outer boundary of the DMA. The yellow and green areas are townships within 5 to 10 miles of the DMA boundary, and those distances are based on deer movement research that we've done. The reason we do those townships is to try to catch any positive deer that may be outside the DMA and start being able to manage them and reduce any further spread of the disease any further beyond the DMA. So that's why we sample roadkills beyond the DMA boundary. Last year, we sampled 521 roadkills. And again, in Jefferson and a little bit in Clarion County. So quickly summarize our sampling for the past year. We sampled almost 1,600 deer. Over 1,000 of those were hunter harvested deer, and over half of those were from the DMA. Again, we did the 521 road kills, and we had 28 deer that fell into the other category, either suspects or escapees. And we had one new wild positive in Jefferson County. That was a roadkill in the southeastern corner of the county. In that area, we already had some positives, so we did not have to change the DMA boundary in response to that positive deer. And counting the original positive captive facility we had in 2014, we've had 6 wild positives and 2 captive facilities positive for CWD since it was originally found. And one last thing I wanted to mention, we've used the Deer Management Assistance Program, or DMAP, to help us increase our sampling in the DMA. We originally made the entire DMA a DMAP unit, but with the return of concurrent seasons this past year, we felt we did not need DMA in the entire, or DMAP in the entire DMA. So we eliminated it. We still got an adequate number of samples, and it allowed us to apply our DMAP to areas specifically around positive deer, and that's illustrated here in this slide. And the one deer on the Indiana border was just below Jefferson County, so the DMAP unit created around that extended slightly into Jefferson County. So that's a very quick wrap up of CWD in the Northwest region and our portion of DMA3. So I will finish up. If anyone again has any questions, put them in the Q&A section, and I'll try to answer them at the end of the session. Any questions for me? And thank you very much for joining us tonight. And with that, I will close out here and turn it back over to you, Matt.
Thank you very much, Roger. That was very informative. If anybody has any questions for Roger, like he said, put them in the Q&A and we'll address them at the end. Next up, we have Brian Richards, the Emerging Disease Coordinator with the National Wildlife Health Center, to give us a national perspective of chronic wasting disease. And Brian's out of Madison, Wisconsin. So Brian, floor is yours.
Thank you, Matt. Just double checking you can hear me and see the screen.
I can hear you and I can see the screen.
All right. Great. Well, thank you very much. And so good evening all. Again, my name is Brian Richards. I'm a wildlife biologist at the U.S. Geological Survey's National Wildlife Health Center in Madison, Wisconsin. Our science center, which you can see a photo of in this slide, is diagnostic and wildlife disease research, and we provide epidemiological and technical assistance to state, tribal, and federal partners. We're the only federal facility with a focus solely on wildlife health. We're recognized by the World Organization for Animal Health as a collaborating center for wildlife health and biodiversity, and by the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations as a reference center for wildlife health and wildlife disease diagnostics. We've been around since 1975 and have been involved with a number of pretty high profile and important wildlife disease issues during that time frame. From the days of lead poisoning through West Nile virus, white nose syndrome, highly pathogenic avian influenza. More recently, just beginning a year or so ago, rabbit hemorrhagic disease virus 2 and SARS coronavirus 2 in wildlife. We've been involved with CWD since 2002, literally the day after it was announced to have been detected in the state of Wisconsin. I've been at the center since 2004, and I was with Texas Parks and Wildlife Department for a decade prior to that. So this evening, I'll be giving you a pretty short primer and an update on CWD in North America. Before I start, I would like to take a moment to thank the sponsors, the National Deer Association, the Pennsylvania Game Commission, and the Penn Wildlife Futures Program for sponsoring this event. And I'd like to thank the members of the audience for taking the time and the effort to attend tonight. So I start the presentation tonight with some snippets from a newspaper article published in Penn Live a couple weeks ago. The article was written by Matthew Schneck. And so he starts out identifying deer killed by hunters last year in Pennsylvania in the hot zone were found to be infected at a rate of 14%, up from 8% the previous hunting year. And that involved testing more than 12,000 whitetails by the Game Commission. Total of those, or a total of 18 of those, were found to have CWD. And Matthew Schnupp, the director of the Commission's Bureau of Wildlife Management, described that as literally as a punch in the stomach for wildlife managers and hunters. One of your commissioners, Timothy Layton, said the only hope for making things better in the established area and for keeping CWD at bay elsewhere in the state is for hunters to help wildlife managers. And the author went on to identify that hunter resistance to deer reduction efforts can be a stumbling block to efforts to battle the disease. So to summarize, it seems like CWD has a pretty good foothold in Pennsylvania, and it's likely getting worse. Management efforts don't seem to be working very well. And it's identified that if hunters don't support and actively engage in management, things are not likely to change. In fact, CWD will likely continue to spread and grow in other parts of the state. And so that's a reality that's been experienced over and over in other states and provinces. And it's pretty simple to suggest that the road you seem to be headed down right now is likely going to lead to a lot more of those punches to the stomach. So I'll start with a couple observations, high-level observations about CWD. What's it doing? Well, it's spreading geographically, both nationally and in Pennsylvania. Prevalence, or the proportion of the population affected with CWD, is growing in many locations, including Pennsylvania. It kills deer directly, but what may be more important is that CWD results in a progressive neurological degeneration and thus predisposes deer to other sources of mortality, like getting hit by a car, an arrow, or a bullet. Whatever the ultimate cause, deer with CWD tend to die much sooner than they otherwise would have. Some of the consequences of CWD. First, it's expensive. It's very expensive. Every facet of CWD costs real dollars to natural resource agencies, including your Game Commission. And on top of that, CWD has tended to erode stakeholder trust in their management agencies. But in the longer term, there's pretty substantial impacts on deer themselves. Deer populations tend to suffer in the long term. So initially, you might start to see a decline in harvestable surplus, or that segment of the population you hunt every year. And in a few areas with very high prevalence over the long haul, CWD has actually driven population decline. Demographic shifts to younger age classes are also likely to occur. So if your goal is to produce older aged animals, those often managed for and desired by hunters, you're likely to not be able to sustain that goal in the long run. Hunter behavior is also predicted to change by human dimensions researchers. So if you hunt in an area with high prevalence, maybe in that 30 to 40+% range, either you or a family member is likely to alter your hunting behavior, either choosing to hunt elsewhere or to stop deer hunting altogether. And if that happens, the impacts of that circle back to the ability of the Game Commission to manage not only deer, but all the other resources that rely on hunting license revenue. So I throw a picture here of a deer, and does she have CWD? Well, maybe. I can't tell you whether this deer has CWD or not. Nobody can, or just by looking at it. So a deer with CWD looks and acts perfectly normal for many months before it starts to develop those classic wasting, signs. But if this deer has CWD, as Roger identified earlier, she's actively shedding infectious agent into the environment, and she's capable of infecting other deer. She looks and acts just fine, though. This is one of the real issues that natural resource managers have with CWD. Most hunters, even in hard-hit areas, have never seen a deer in the clinical phase of CWD, so it's hard to fathom that this silent killer is really out there, but it is. This slide lists some of the characteristics of CWD. We'll go through them really quickly. So CWD is a transmissible spongiform encephalopathy. That's the same category of diseases, which include Creutzfeldt-Jakob's disease in humans and bovine spongiform encephalopathy in cattle. Hallmarks of all TSEs include a long incubation period, progressive neurological degeneration, a relatively brief clinical phase, followed by death. CWD and its cousin scrapie in sheep are unique among TSEs in that diseased animals shed infectious agent via bodily fluids like saliva, urine, and feces, and can directly infect other herd or flock members. Deer become infected with CWD by ingesting or inhaling this infectious agent. Transmission can be via direct contact or indirect with a contaminated environmental fomite. Vertical or doe to fawn transmission prior to birth has been documented and plays an unknown role in nature. Incubation period is protracted, followed by a brief clinical phase. Infected animals shed infectious agent long before the onset of clinical disease, and shed prions can persist in the environment for years, likely decades, and serve as a reservoir of infectivity for other animals. We tend to see higher infection rates in males and in older age classes of each sex. So we can test for disease in live deer, but it's very challenging. So the majority of our surveillance samples are collected from hunter-killed animals after they're brought in. And at this time, management tools are really limited. There's little evidence of widespread genetic resistance. And so when you add all these up, if you're a wildlife manager, you can see that CWD is extremely challenging to manage in free-ranging populations. So what does CWD do to individual deer? Well, as mentioned, CWD is a death sentence for every deer that gets it. If disease runs its full course, it's likely a couple years on average, but due to that progressive neurological degeneration, most CWD positive deer die of some other factor, and they die even sooner. So that's kind of the basics of what CWD is and what it does to deer. But why should we care? After all, there's lots of deer out there. So in 2016, Doctors Mike Miller and John Fisher presented a paper at the North American Natural Resources Conference describing our first 50 years of experience with CWD. And in that paper, they posed two overarching reasons why we might be concerned about CWD. First, that CWD in the long run is very hard on deer populations. The second is that we cannot rule out that CWD could someday become a human health issue. So that remains an open question, but not consuming venison from CWD positive deer is what human health experts recommend. I'm going to take a few minutes and go through some of the data and science regarding CWD and what it might be doing at the population level to cervids or members of the deer family. So here's the current documented distribution of CWD in North America. It's now been picked up in 26 states, 3 Canadian provinces, in either free-ranging and or captive commercial facilities. So on the captive side, CWD has been detected in approximately 150 facilities in the US and 128 in Canada. On the map, the polygons you see there represent CWD where it's been detected in wild deer, elk, and moose. And the dots represent captive deer operations where CWD has been detected. So in addition to North America, CWD has been documented in South Korea, Norway, Finland, and Sweden. So pretty clearly, CWD's got a substantial footprint here in North America, both in wild and captive deer. So I'll take you back in time to 2005. That's just a few short years after CWD was detected in Wisconsin, right after CWD was detected in New York and West Virginia. Things look quite a bit different on that map than they do today. So now I'll take you up to early 2013. And this was right after Pennsylvania announced their first detections in wild deer. And a single captive deer farm had already been detected in Pennsylvania by that time in 2012. Here we are back at the current time. Both Pennsylvania and the rest of North America looks quite a bit different than it did a mere 8 years ago. Now I'm going to hone in a little bit on your region. So this is right after your initial detection in 2012. CWD had also been documented in Virginia, Maryland, and a single county in Virginia. And there's that initial captive facility over in Adams County. Now back to the current time. CWD has been detected in wild deer in 14 counties in Pennsylvania and more to the south. It's also been confirmed in 28 captive deer facilities in Pennsylvania as of now. It's important for me to note that, this map includes an entire county shaded, even if there's only a single wild positive detected in that county to date. That's the level of information that I have access to, and at the national level, when I map it, it works just fine. But when I zoom into smaller areas, it does tend to exaggerate where CWD has been confirmed. That being said, the way this disease spreads might not be an exaggeration for that long. Here's a case in point. Virginia just yesterday or today announced a detection in Montgomery County in a 2.5-year-old buck taken by a hunter last November. And that's some 160 miles away from their closest existing case. And Ohio documented their first wild positives in the state in Wyandotte County in 2 deer taken this past season. So these maps don't tend to stay static for very long. Now I'm going to show you some data from my home state of Wisconsin. And the red squares on this map are 1-mile sections where CWD has been confirmed in 1 or more hunter-killed deer. So CWD was first confirmed here in 2002, and the State Department of Natural Resources conducted a massive amount of surveillance the next few years. Over 40,000 samples were collected in 2002 alone, and those were primarily hunter-killed deer. So this map represents a real good approximation of where CW likely was in 2005. Now up to the current time. CWD was detected in 1,578 deer in Wisconsin last year alone. And that was out of just under 19,000 samples collected. So recall that you had in Pennsylvania 218 positives out of about 12,000 samples. In Wisconsin, CWD has now been documented in 32 of 72 counties in the state in wild deer in a little over 8,000 individual positive deer. Sampling in the state is voluntary, so what's been detected is a clear subset of the actual number killed by hunters and what exists today out in the wild. Plus, we have 29 captive facilities in the state where CWD has been detected. So I'd argue that there's been a pretty dramatic expansion in CWD's footprint nationally in my home state of Wisconsin, in Pennsylvania, and elsewhere. But what about prevalence, or that proportion of the population affected by disease? Is disease increasing as well as spreading? We'll take a look. Here's some data again from Wisconsin. The 3 red dots on the map are areas where CWD is performing quite well. And now I'm going to zoom in on one of the prevalence charts. Curves represent the proportion of deer that tested positive and how that increased over time. You can see in this zone, CWD was pretty much non-existent back in 2002 and for the next several years. Then it really started to take off. Today, if you shoot a mature buck in this zone, it's literally 50-50 odds that that deer has CWD, 1 in 3 odds that adult does in yearling bucks, and 1 in 5 yearling does has CWD. So here's an image I took from the Game Commission website showing CWD testing results. I think this is for all results for samples collected last year. Reported percentage positive is pretty small, less than 2%. But what I find interesting is take a look at the rate of growth in the bar chart on the lower right. The rate of detecting positives is increasing, and it's increasing rapidly. So this time, I selected adult males and hunter-killed deer. The geographic extent is likely just the CWD DMUs, but now you're up to almost 5% prevalence. And we would expect that, as adult males are more likely to be CWD positive than other herd segments. But look at that growth trend in the lower right. So I sketched an exponential growth curve over the top of that chart, and the visual fit is pretty good. So unfortunately, I'd argue that CWD appears to be performing in your core area in a fashion very similar to that in Wisconsin, Alberta, Saskatchewan, and other locations. And why wouldn't it? What is Pennsylvania doing today, and what's Pennsylvania willing to do tomorrow or next year to alter that trend and outcome? So earlier I mentioned one of the potential long-term outcomes of CWD is hunters changing their behavior in CWD zones. So a good friend of mine is very active in both CWD and on the social media front. He started soliciting what he referred to as CWD stories from some of his contributors. And here's one from the very core of the CWD area in Wisconsin. So beginning in 2014, a group of hunting buddies started leasing some land, 280 acres in the very core of CWD land in Wisconsin. During that time frame, 4 years, every single buck they killed was CWD positive. So a total of 12 or more CWD positive deer. It became so bad that we gave up the lease and checked out. We couldn't stand shooting the deer and not being able to eat them. To me, that's pretty sobering. CWD story. I can't imagine wanting to hunt there myself. And so that's an outcome. That's a long-term outcome when CWD really starts taking hold in a system very much like the one, in the south central portion of the Commonwealth. So what can be done about CWD? And what's the Commonwealth willing to do? Remember that statement coming from Commissioner Layton about needing hunter support? So I have to insert a caveat here when I discuss management options. Pennsylvania is not my home state. I have no management prerogative or authority in your state or anywhere else for that matter. So I cannot and do not ever want to tell you what to do. That's your choice, not mine. But there are some opportunities. I think of this as kind of a two-part story. First, if you don't have CWD, you might want to consider doing everything you can to keep it that way. You do have control here. First, identify all the possible ways that CWD could come to you, and people are involved in most of those. Then implement regulatory measures to stop or slow those processes. The regulations on their own are likely not enough. Providing information and education to stakeholders is necessary. So a well-informed populace, I believe, is more likely to make better choices and reduce risk. So another caveat, if you're really close, adjacent to where CWD is in the wild, those precautionary measures will likely be less effective. So you might be able to get humans to stop or slow down moving CWD, but the deer will continue to move disease themselves, and that's much harder to address. So part two, if you have CWD, do something about it, but do it in measurable and meaningful ways that can actually alter outcomes. As an example, Pennsylvania and a lot of other states are doing a tremendous amount of surveillance right now, and that's good. Learning about how CWD is performing is a great idea, but surveillance itself is not active disease management. Surveillance is watching, but it cannot alter disease outcomes. So early on, I mentioned that the CWD toolbox doesn't have a lot in it. Well, what would a really good looking toolbox, be filled with? For CWD, here's some of the tools I think would be useful. And there's researchers working on some of them, and maybe we'll have them. But we don't have them today, and likely will not for a very long time to come. First, there's ongoing research into vaccines, but I think we're likely years away from that. And even if we have a vaccine, we have a significant logistical hurdle trying to figure out how to deliver it to millions of deer across such a large swath of North America. There's also ongoing work into genetic resistance, but to date, there's no genotype that's truly resistant to CWD. They all seem to get the disease. Some just live longer than others. And once again, how do we produce enough to alter genetic composition at the population level in the wild? Disinfectants, both for use with tools, surfaces, vehicles, and to mitigate environmental contamination in the wild. I think that one would be tremendously beneficial. And if we could somehow identify whether a deer has CWD remotely, then selectively remove only the positives, then we could really start to alter outcomes. Better tests, especially ones where we can determine whether CWD is or is not in an area without ever testing a deer. Science is making real progress on that one, but again, just knowing where disease is does not alter outcomes. It's still watching, just with better tools. Again, we don't have these tools today, but I would argue it makes a lot of sense to do what we can to address and minimize CWD now, and it'll be simpler to use these tools if and when they are developed. So what do we have for tools today? Essentially, we have the same ones we've had for a very long time, and that's lethal removal of animals from affected populations, both inside fences and in the wild. There's different ways to use this tool, depending on your situation and goals. So I won't go into great detail here, but this tool is one that does hold promise if wielded in an aggressive, sustained, and targeted manner. The last 2 points are really critical as well. Are there any impediments to removing deer in Pennsylvania today? Are there seasons, bag limits, restrictions on any group or cohort of deer that prevent willing hunters and landowners from taking this task on? And are there any mechanisms that the Commonwealth could adopt that might compel reluctant stakeholders to participate? Experience suggests that you're going to have to think outside the box to be successful with this disease. Good news is you don't have to start completely from scratch. So here's 2 resources I highly recommend. AFWA, or the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, recently published a set of best management practices. And the Western states and provinces, who've been dealing with CWD longer than anyone else, published a set of adaptive management guidelines a few years ago. These are available freely online, and I would encourage anyone interested in CWD to take a look at them. So here's the core of the best management practices for actively dealing with CWD in the wild. They make sense and represent what science and experience offer. First, targeting the deer most likely to have CWD. Remember, that begins with the adult males. Second, targeting animals in CWD hotspots. Kind of analogy is putting out a campfire before it shoots sparks out and lights the forest on fire. Adjusting season timing. Do you have open hunting in the peak of the rut? Do you allow the most efficient weapons to be used during the rut? And are there limits on the number of kind of deer that hunters can take? Reducing density in CWD zones. The lower the population, the fewer the positives you have out there. Lowering density likely will not reduce prevalence, at least in the short run, but it will reduce the standing crop of positives. And from a disease perspective, that's a really good thing. And eliminating any practices that congregate deer. Baiting, feeding, lures, both natural and artificial, they're all designed to attract deer to a specific place and time, and all enhance the risk of deer-to-deer transmission. So we have tools that can be employed, but we just looked at the maps and the prevalence curves, and it doesn't seem like we're having a lot of success. Why is that? So in this slide, there's the photo of Aldo Leopold. He's known as the father of wildlife management and a prolific writer. Leopold identified wildlife management as a 3-legged stool, and you have to have all 3 legs on that stool to be successful. But even in 1943, he recognized that people management was the hardest of the 3 legs. And CWD is a prime example of this. So Dr. Jordan Pechenik is a retired social scientist from the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources. He's a human dimensions specialist. These next few slides are from a talk he gave shortly before he retired and are based on over 15 years of working with stakeholders on CWD in Wisconsin. So in Wisconsin and elsewhere, including Pennsylvania, when CWD is initially detected, there's a lot of support for actively addressing the disease. It's Pennsylvania Game Commission's mission to provide healthy wildlife. Landowners don't want CWD, and hunters generally support some measures to take more deer out of that system. But there is a caveat. They have to be convinced that their individual efforts will make a difference. And even if there's strong support initially, it tends to wane over time. Why? Well, it turns out there's a host of what Jordan referred to as restraining forces that push back against the will to support active CWD management, and eventually they overwhelm. Things like sharpshooting, bounties for deer, just not popular. Evidence. Remember how few hunters have actually seen a CWD positive deer in clinical phase? Hunter ethic. Most hunt for sport or tradition, things like that. Asking them to be disease managers is really challenging. And even if they are willing, hunters have a personal consumption limit, and they're unlikely to harvest a lot of extra deer if they cannot use them. Many are not in favor of the type of population reduction that might be necessary to alter outcomes. Doubt. This creeps in over time, and there's a lot of alternative theories floating around on the internet and social media that fuel doubt. And what about risk? Many hunters simply believe there's little to no risk to either deer or humans. So we begin with attitudinal support. Nobody wants CWD, but what we lack is behavioral support. Attitudinal support has failed to translate into sustained behavioral support for actively and aggressively managing CWD in many places and over again. So what are the issues we truly have to deal with? Well, keeping CWD from moving farther across your state and North America. Managing the disease where it is today in ways that can alter outcomes. Managing CWD in the commercial captive cervid industry. Identifying those risk factors, pathways for disease movement, and managing those factors. Misinformation. Again, we live in a society where misinformation can thrive, move very rapidly, and influence a lot of stakeholders. And if stakeholders do not support the Game Commission, actively support the Game Commission, the trends you're already documenting are very likely to continue. So I'm going to finish up where I started. The data to date that we looked at, to be honest, they don't look very promising, but I do think it can be turned around. CWD can be managed, but it's not going to be simple. Outcomes can be altered, but it will not be quick. CWD management, I like to refer to, it's not an a la carte menu. You can't just pick a few relatively simple regulatory measures and hope to alter outcomes. It just doesn't work that way. Commissioner Layton really nailed it. The only hope for making things better is for hunters to help wildlife managers. So thanks very much for the opportunity to speak with you this evening. And I believe we're going to take questions later on after the other speakers. And with that, I'll turn it back over to you, Matt. Thanks.
Thank you so much for a wonderful presentation, Brian. Next, we have Kip Adams, Chief Conservation Officer from the National Deer Association, and Kip will be talking about the hunter perspective of chronic wasting disease. So Kip, please take the floor.
All right. Well, thank you, Matt. Great job by Roger and Brian, kind of explaining what's going on in the Northwest region there, and then the overview of CWD and just how terrible of a disease this is. My job here tonight then is to take the science side of what Brian just shared with us and really relate this to the hunters. This is what it means for us. And I'll say this, I'm very proud to be a Pennsylvania native. I live in the North Central region. I'm very proud to be a wildlife biologist. I've been a biologist for more than 25 years now, but I am first and foremost a deer hunter. And that's why this is near and dear to my heart, and why I enjoy talking with hunters about this, to be able to share information, what this means for us, and how we can directly fight this disease. And I'm a firm believer that every hunter that's out there today, we can fight this, and we can help keep this from spreading and getting worse. So I think the more we understand about it, the better job we can do being good stewards and help minimize the spread of this until the science catches up and gives us some type of cure for it. So let's take the science and show us exactly what this means to us as hunters. And really, to start that, though, we have to kind of understand the importance of deer. We know that about 79% of American hunters pursue deer, by far more than any other species that's out there. And to let you know, there's about 11 million deer hunters. Any given year, this is how many people pursue deer. By comparison, there's only about 3 million turkey hunters, and turkeys are the second most hunted species. There's about 1.5 million duck hunters, less than 1 million elk hunters. So deer hunters dwarf all the other species segments of the hunting industry. And what we know is that deer drive the industry. They are the most sought after game species that we have, and deer hunters contribute about 60% of the entire 37 billion that's generated from hunting. This is big numbers. And the important part about this is money that's coming from license fees, from excise taxes off the backs of hunters, gear that they're buying. And the thing that we need to understand is that this funds most of our wildlife management programs. Some state wildlife agencies are very lucky and they get a part of the tax base for wildlife management funding, but most of them are solely funded through license efforts, excise taxes, and from hunting expenses. So hunters are critically important to having healthy deer populations, because this is where a lot of the funds to manage those species come from. And it's not just deer. All of the management that we have for other game species, non-game species, songbirds, etc., most of that comes from hunters. And as you see here, the majority of this comes straight from deer hunters. So if you're a deer hunter, this is obviously a very big issue to you. If you're not a deer hunter, if you're just a deer enthusiast or just a wildlife enthusiast, or you like to watch songbirds or butterflies, you should care that we have healthy deer to ensure that we have solid and well-funded wildlife management programs. Right here, specifically in Pennsylvania, hunting contributes about 1.6 billion annually to our economy. So it's a big deal. It's a really big deal here in the Keystone State. Well, we're often talking about CWD relative to hunters, and that's because the susceptible species are things we like to chase through the woods: mule deer, elk, black-tailed deer, whitetails, moose, reindeer, and possibly others. But all these that you see here in white, these are all species that have confirmed the disease. So it's stuff that we like to hunt. Some of it we chase in different parts of the country than others, but it's stuff that's very near and dear to the hearts of hunters, stuff that's very important to our entire wildlife management systems. And this is one of the reasons why this is such a big deal, and a much bigger deal than even whitetails here in Pennsylvania. Well, quickly here then with CWD information, we've had great information already on this. I'm just going to remind you of 3 points which really hit home to us as hunters. With regard to this disease, there is no vaccine, there is no cure, and it is 100% fatal to all whitetails. So if you're a deer hunter or a deer enthusiast, this hits us right in the guts. We hear some talk about potential resistance with some phenotypes of deer. The reality of it is there are some that tend to live a little bit longer with this disease, but it's 100% fatal to all of them. It's going to get every one of them. Specifically with whitetails, we know that probability of infection increases in age for both bucks and does. And adult bucks are about twice as likely as adult does to have this. Now, my job here is to make sure that we can understand this straight in a hunting situation. So this is one of the reasons why state wildlife agencies want us to reduce deer herds once we get into disease zones and reduce age structures for both the bucks and the doe side. Because Brian showed you those graphs that show that as deer get older, the likelihood of them having this disease increases dramatically. And the thing that's really dangerous about this is if a deer has this, it can give this to other deer. So it shares this with other deer. Unfortunately, it would be nice if they were a little bit selfish and kept it to themselves, but they can give this to other deer, both directly and indirectly. So that's why, from a disease management standpoint, it's important for us to fight this by trying to reduce the age structures of bucks and does to keep them from spreading. This is a picture of one of the first 3 wild deer in Wisconsin that was confirmed with the disease. And I'm going to show you this picture because we saw some pictures earlier of deer, and both of our speakers have said, hey, you can't look at a deer and know if it has this disease or not. And the fact of the matter is, the vast majority of the deer with this disease will never live long enough to do the wasting away or show you what it looks like at the end. So most people will never see that. And to give you a highlight with this, they can carry it for, on average, 18 to 24 months before they show any signs at all. Once they do start showing signs, or they go downhill very rapidly. And that's why I'm showing you this picture of this deer. Take a look at how skinny it is. Something looks clearly wrong with this animal. In case here, it turned out it was chronic wasting disease. But take a look at his antlers. His antlers are big, aren't they? So what this means is this deer was at least healthy enough during the antler growing phase of this year to grow a very healthy set of antlers. So essentially, April through August of 2001, this deer appeared very normal. So even while now, this lucky hunter, I guess, or unlucky hunter, or however you want to look at it, shot this during the firearm season later in the year. If he had shot it earlier in the year, archery season, it likely would have appeared very normal with no symptoms at all of this wasting away. So that's very important to know and understand. And this is one of the reasons why we just simply don't find dead deer laying everywhere. Something else is going to get them first. All right. Well, how is CWD introduced into an new area? Well, one of the easiest ways is by movement of an infected captive deer. And this is because there is not a reliable and practical live animal test that we can do. So deer are moved among facilities unknowingly having the disease. It's not that captive facility owners want to do this. They certainly wouldn't move it if they knew they had it. We just don't have a really good way of testing. We're getting better, and science is really helping us here, but we don't have one yet. And to give you an idea of just how much movement occurs, this is from a research thesis here in Pennsylvania. This is over a 10-year period, all of the known, legal, recorded movements of captive deer among facilities. So there is tremendous movement on the landscape. And we know now for a fact that we have moved captive deer across state lines and introduced CWD into captive facilities in other states as well. So this is an easy way and a big way that we can move this disease. But it's not the only way. We know that we can move this disease with immigration of an infected wild deer. We know the deer move. Research in Pennsylvania and other places show that half to 3/4 of all our yearling bucks are going to leave between 12 and 18 months of age, and they're going to disperse 1 to 5 miles away. If that deer has the disease, it's taking it with it and introducing it into a new area and into new deer. So this is one of the reasons that we want to reduce some of this movement of animals because we don't want them to be able to take that away. And this is why some state wildlife agencies are specifically targeting yearling bucks early in the year, such that to try to harvest them prior to them dispersing and moving the disease. Well, from a hunter's end, and this is one way that we are contributing to the problem and can really contribute to the solution, deer can get this by contact with the remains of infected deer. So what this means is if you harvest a deer and you're in a disease zone, you don't want to move the high-risk parts of that carcass out of that zone or take them to a new area. The high-risk parts are the brain, the eyes, the spleen, the backbone. So this is why if you're in a disease zone, Pennsylvania Game Commission does not allow you to take these out of that zone. And this is also why many states don't allow you to bring any of those parts into their state, regardless of where you got them from, if it's a disease zone or not. Because say I harvest a deer in a disease zone that has the disease. Say I leave the zone, I take these high-risk parts elsewhere. I come back home or I go visit a buddy and I dump those parts on the landscape. With those parts being there, other deer that come into contact with them can contract the disease. So this is why we don't want this movement. So two best things we absolutely can do right now to minimize spread of this disease: stop moving live deer and stop moving the high-risk parts of harvested deer. So as hunters, we absolutely can help from that perspective. All right, well, let's talk about some of the impacts that we have here on us hunters and on society. Well, once CWD is confirmed, deer population reduction is often one of the first things that we see. So we take this, and the idea now is to let's reduce this deer herd, and in many cases below even what the habitat can support. Now, as hunters, though, this one obviously hits us hard because nobody wants to see fewer deer. You have never heard a hunter say, man, when I go hunting tomorrow, I hope I see fewer deer than I did yesterday. You know, that's not in our DNA. We want to see deer, and we want to see a lot of deer. But the reality of it is, once this disease shows up, it is in our best interest to reduce deer herds, to minimize congregation, and to minimize them spreading it among individuals that are with them. There's research out of Wisconsin that shows that if you have an adult doe that is infected, all of her relatives that live nearby are 10 times more likely to also contract the disease. So this is in our favor to listen to what our agencies are asking us to do and take an extra antlerless deer, reduce these deer herds, and just minimize any of this transmission among the deer herd. It's not something that we would have to live with forever, but the better of a job we do right now in reducing this and minimizing spread, the better job we're doing to safeguard the future of these deer herds and ensure that we have healthy deer a long time into the future. Well, we also know that once CWD arrives, it's essentially the end of deer season as you know it. And you know what, hunters, we tend to be extremely traditional with regard to what we want. I grew up in a northern Pennsylvania deer camp. I'm very fortunate to still get to hunt out of that same camp today. So I know what it's like. We want to have deer season start on the same day. We want to have the same guys and gals in camp. We want to go sit at the same tree stand or same deer stand on opening day. We're very traditional with regard to that. And there's a lot of great things about that. And so once we get CWD, all of that goes out the window. And that can be a hard pill to swallow, but it's a very necessary pill. Once you get it, we end up with CWD check stations, CWD samples. So there's headless deer that are going home. And is this an inconvenience to us hunters? Heck yeah, it definitely is. But you know what? It's an inconvenience well worth doing to ensure the safety and the future of our deer herd. We also know that once it arrives, we get movement regulations. We can't be taking the high-risk parts out of this zone, and that's for very good reason. We often end up with longer hunting seasons, additional hunting seasons, sharpshooting, all of these things that are very different from what we've had in the past. But I'm here to tell you, it's all things that are very necessary to help minimize spread of this disease and to protect our deer herds and safeguard our future. We have a loss of privileges. When we have this, there's no more feeding, no more baiting, no using minerals, in many cases, no urine attractants. And this is all because we know that this disease can be, or the infectious materials here can be spread through saliva, urine, blood, feces. So particularly from a feeding and a baiting end here, we don't want deer coming in and eating out of the exact same spot or swapping spit in these areas. So that is why these are put into place to try to protect the deer herd. So if you like to use bait for camera surveys in late summer, formal camera surveys are great ways to estimate numbers of deer using a property and estimated age structure and farm recruitment rates and all kinds of good stuff. But that all goes out the window if the disease is there, and for good reason. There's no more using minerals to photograph deer. If you like to scout deer pre-season, it's a great way to get deer in front of a camera. but for reasons we just talked about, we don't want to do that anymore. I have a colleague in Missouri who is a great photo that he uses in CWD talks. It's a picture of a deer with CWD standing at a mineral lick, and there's water in the mineral lick, and he is drooling into this lick, standing with his ears drooped, clearly in some of the advanced stages of the disease. So he is drinking water, taking minerals from this lick, clearly putting saliva in here where other deer can come in contact with it. And there are two sets of deer eyes right behind him waiting to get to this mineral lick to take the next lick. And that deer ended up having CWD and clearly was sharing those infectious materials with the next deer who wanted in line, wanting to come in there. So that is exactly why there is none more of the baiting, feeding, or mineral licks, because that's the last thing we want is deer licking out of the exact same spot. Once you get the disease, then mature bucks are not encouraged. Brian talked about this, and I shared some information that older deer tend to have higher prevalence rates. So it's to our benefit to drive deer herds younger from both the buck side and the doe side. And this is one thing where as hunters, we really can help out. You may be amazed to realize that across the United States, far fewer hunters shoot deer than you may think. And at the National Deer Association, we conduct a national survey of this. All state wildlife agencies we collect this data from. And today, only about 41% of the hunters in the United States shoot a single deer each year. Less than half of the hunters kill a single deer. You know, and Georgia is a perfect example. When you buy your deer license or your hunt license in Georgia, you get the opportunity to shoot 8 antlerless deer and 2 bucks. You can kill 10 deer. But even in Georgia, less than half of the hunters kill a single deer. And even more amazing, only 18% of the hunters in the United States shoot more than 1 deer. So think about that. Less than half of the hunters kill 1. Less than 1 in 5 hunters are going to kill more than 1. So we have a huge opportunity here as hunters to take additional deer and help drive these population or the ages younger to help us in this fight. And, you know, a lot of people would just say, well, I can't eat the meat, so I'm not going to shoot that next one. And you know what? I have a perfect solution to this. Today in the United States, 1 out of 7 households are food insecure. Think about that. In today's day, they don't have enough protein. Here is a perfect opportunity for us to help ourselves, help the deer resource, and at the same time, help families that don't have enough food to eat. And I'll talk a little more about this later, but we have a win-win-win situation here right at our fingertips. We just need to take advantage of it. Once you get CWD, license money gets diverted from herd and habitat management. We have to do things like CWD sampling and monitoring and surveillance, and this is all very necessary stuff. Example here in the state of Wisconsin, since they've confirmed it, they have spent over $50 million on this. It's very necessary to understand what the prevalence rate of the disease is, how far it's spread, because based on that, that's how the DNR there, and in our case, the Pennsylvania Game Commission, knows how to attack this. Low prevalence rates and a low rate of spread necessitate different techniques and measures than high rates of spread and real high prevalence rates. And Andrea will talk more about what the Game Commission is doing and how they're attacking this in her presentation when I'm done. But just suffice to say, this is a really, really expensive disease. Now, just think about it from this end. Rather than having to spend this money on CWD, and I'm the first to say, thank God the DNR there did spend this on it. But if they didn't have the disease, don't you think they would have rather spent the money on hunter access, land purchases, habitat enhancement, all kinds of other things to benefit habitat, other wildlife species, and hunters? So heck yeah, they definitely would have. So we need to understand that this is a really, really expensive disease. We also know that hunting participation rates can decline. I'm going to use Wisconsin again here. This is the number of paid license holders the final year before they found that they had CWD. The next year, look how much this dropped. Dropped a bunch. People were unsure. They didn't know what was going on. The next year, it rebounded a little bit. But look over the next 10-year period, it never did recover. Never recovered at all. And there may be some folks here, hunters, saying, well, you know what? Fewer hunters is not necessarily a bad thing. I don't want people right next to me when I'm hunting either. And I'll say this, that's a pretty short-sighted opinion, because fewer hunters leads to less money for wildlife. And I've told you, most of our wildlife management programs are funded by hunters. So when we have fewer hunters, we have less money available to manage wildlife, to enhance habitat. That's not good. And fewer hunters leads to less advocates for hunting. That's never good. Today, only about 4% of the U.S. population purchases a hunting license. 4%. You know, and you hear some people say, it's my God-given right to hunt, and I'll always be able to do that. Man, I wish that was true. But we don't get to do anything in the United States today because 4% of us like to do it. We get to hunt today because nearly 80% of adult Americans support hunting. They support legal, ethical, regulated hunting. That's why we get to hunt, not because 4% of us do it. So we get to hunt because of that. So we need all the advocates that we absolutely can get for hunting. We also need to continue to portray a very positive public image. Hence, back to that thing I just said a minute ago about feeding needy people. And so as hunters, we can be good stewards. We can help our deer herds. We can help our state wildlife agencies. We can feed people who need food, and we can enhance our public image even more to maintain high hunter approval rates. So that's a perfect cycle for us to be in, and hunters can be the heroes here. We also know that once CWD hits an area, there's economic repercussions. And this is because there is no way of what we know right now to decontaminate a CWD positive site. Those infectious materials remain in that soil for years or decades, as Brian shared with us earlier. So what that means is that in many cases, land value declines. In Missouri, when they first confirmed the disease, they had a loss of $200 to $400 per acre. That's a big per acre loss in monetary value if the area had confirmed CWD. So we certainly are not interested in having that. We know that no state has won the CWD battle. Those prions remain in the soil. The disease continues to spread through deer herds. And this is one of the ways that this is very different from some of the other prion diseases, like mad cow disease, the version of this in cattle. If a cow has it, you can have it in a pasture with 1,000 other cows. It's not going to give it to them. It can't. And man, I wish it was that way with deer, but it's not. Unfortunately, with deer, if a deer has this disease, it can give it to other deer that it comes into contact with. So because of that, nobody has won the CWD battle yet. All right, I'm going to show you a few of the same graphs that Brian did. I'm going to show you 3 different ones here. This particular one is South Central Iowa County. And take a look back in 2002 when this disease was first confirmed here. And these have the same 4 lines on that Brian showed, but we're just going to pay attention to the solid blue line. This is the adult male. These were all bucks that were 2.5 years and older. Back in 2002, only about 1% of the bucks in South Central Iowa County had the disease. Fast forward a few years and take a look at this. 30% of the bucks by 2014 had it. And does this curve look like it's slowing down at all? It is not. It is continuing to gain speed. Let's shift gears then to southeastern Richland County. Look at that line. 35% of the adult bucks in this county had the disease after starting with about 0% in 02. We'll show you one more county, North Central Iowa County. Even worse here, over 45% of their adult bucks. And I share these with you to show you that, you know what? Pennsylvania Game Commission has done a great job collecting a tremendous amount of data. You know where we are on these growth curves? We're in the early years, but we're at the point where it's starting to pick up steam. And so if we do nothing, we are going to end up with our curves look exactly like this. That is a fact. We know that for sure. That's why this situation is so important here in Pennsylvania, why the Game Commission is putting so much resources toward it, and why we at the National Deer Association clearly identify this as one of the biggest threats to the future of hunting. Whether you choose to believe of this disease or the severity of it in the past or not, I hope that you better understand now how severe this is, because this is exactly what we're going to see in Pennsylvania if we don't do something very drastic about it really, really soon. All right. So what does this mean then? Well, it means that we're going to have fewer mature bucks in the future. If we do nothing, it means we're going to have lower deer densities, and it means we're going to have fewer disease-free deer. None of those are any good for us as hunters, or for us who consume venison, or for the future of our deer herds. Well, what about the safety end of it? CWD venison safe to eat? Well, fortunately, according to both the World Health Organization and the Centers for Disease Control, currently there is no evidence that humans can contract Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, which is the human form of this, from eating CWD-infected deer. However, they both strongly encourage people to not eat venison from deer that have tested positive for the disease. The only way to know if the deer that you shoot has it or not is to get it tested. That's why both of these organizations strongly encourage you to have the deer tested. That's why the Pennsylvania Game Commission does. That's why the National Deer Association does. If you hunt in a disease zone, please get your deer tested, and don't eat that deer until you receive a satisfactory test back from that. But you know what? Some people say, I don't care about that. I've eaten deer in the past. I think it's fine. I'm not going to eat it. And if you choose to do that, then that's certainly your prerogative. You have that right. However, we talked earlier about, the need and the opportunity to share venison with others. So even if you choose to eat deer that hasn't been tested, and I hope that you don't, but even if you did, I hope that you wouldn't feed it to your little boy or your little girl, or maybe a niece and nephew, or little boy or little girl down the street. We don't need to jeopardize the potential safety from this. And I'm not somebody who worries about a lot of things. My wife will be the first to tell you, I don't wash my hands nearly enough. I'm not somebody that worries about getting sick. This stuff doesn't bother me. However, I will say this, I absolutely get deer tested that I harvest in disease zones and wait for those satisfactory tests to come back before I feed it to my family, or certainly before I give it to any of the families that we either share meals with or give entire packages of meat or entire deer to, because we know that they can use that protein. All right. Well, hopefully you understand a little bit now about what this really means to us as hunters and how this impacts us. So I'm going to end then with a few slides here about Pennsylvania specifically to show you what really is going on here in the Commonwealth relative to deer harvest and what it is that we're trying to safeguard. As part of this national survey that I talked about, we collect data on all of the buck harvest per square mile, age structures of buck and doe harvest, all of this, and compile it annually in a deer report. You can get any of these at our website. You can go to deerassociation.com. They're all free downloads. But take a look at this from an antler buck harvest standpoint. This is the top 5 states in the U.S. relative to numbers of bucks they harvested. And you see here, this says the 2019 harvest. That's because there are some states out there now that still haven't analyzed all of the data from the 2020 harvest. So this is the most recent hunting season that every state in the country has data that's analyzed that can share with us. So Pennsylvania, we're on the top 5 list here. We're on the top 5 list every year. Texas is almost always number 1, but Texas is huge, right? It's a big state, a lot of deer hunters. So they should harvest more bucks than everybody else. But we are always on the top 5 list. We kill a lot of bucks here. But you know what? We can also get a little fairer comparison with this, a little more apples to apples. We also look at this buck harvest on a per square mile basis. So what state harvests the most bucks per square mile? This gives the smaller states a chance, a fighting chance to be able to compare here. And what we see with this is we actually fare even a little better. We're number 2 on this list. Michigan's the only state in the country that harvests more bucks per square mile than we do. That's pretty cool. All right, well, how about the antlerless side? Because this is where the rubber really meets the road. Harvesting enough antlerless deer to keep deer herds in balance with the habitat, that's the premise of quality deer management. That is even more important once disease arrives on the scene and we need to reduce deer herds even more. We accomplish that through antlerless deer harvest. Well, top 5 states on this list, Texas is number 1 again, but we're even a little higher. We're number 2 here. If we look at this on a per square mile basis, Pennsylvania fares extremely well again. And I show you this one. Take a look at the top 4 states. Delaware, Pennsylvania, Maryland, and New Jersey. We're all right together in the mid-Atlantic region. We really are in a sweet spot relative to deer management and deer productivity, very high productivity in this region, which means we pump a lot of funds in the system. Survival is very high. We have a lot of deer on the landscape. Super cool if you're a hunter. Lots of deer to see, lots of deer to shoot. But you know what? This also brings with it a responsibility to shoot a lot of deer. I shared with you data a few minutes ago, just relative to the percentage of hunters in the U.S. that shoot 1 or more deer. You know what, in Pennsylvania, our numbers are even lower than the national average. Only about 37% of Pennsylvanians shoot a single deer. Man, we can do way better than that. And only about 13% of our hunters shoot more than 1 deer. So the reality of it is we have a lot of deer in the landscape. We have an increased need to shoot even more. We have a huge hunter base, a small percentage of which is shooting 1 or more deer. So we absolutely can up our game here. And the way to do it is to take that extra deer and be able to donate it to a family that needs it. So Pennsylvania's hunters to the rescue here. Absolutely. We have a good opportunity at hand. I'll end in with this saying that Pennsylvania rocks. If we put a summary together for our hunters, we are one of only 3 states that shoots over 300,000 deer annually. We harvest more bucks in every single state except Michigan, and they just barely edged us out. For the 11th year in a row, over half of our antler buck harvest was at least 2.5 years old. And in fact, it was the oldest ever. If we didn't have disease, this is reason to shoot to the moon. This is awesome. However, once we do have disease in those areas, this can become problematic. So we need to keep that age structure younger. We were harvested over 5 antlerless deer per square mile. Delaware is the only state that shot more. And take a look at this bottom one. If you combine the number of bucks and antlerless deer we shot on a per square mile basis, there's not a single state in the country that shoots more deer per square mile than Pennsylvania. That's pretty cool, especially taking a look at the low percentage of our hunters that actually do shoot a deer. So do we have more? We absolutely do. We're at the top of the list right now, but we need to be even a little bit higher. So I'm hopeful that this upcoming deer season, we can do that. So current status then, there is much concern about the increased spread of CWD, both new states that we're finding in, new areas within states. As Brian showed tonight, new finding in Virginia, which has really been a sucker punch to that state. In states that surround it, particularly North Carolina, just a little bit to the south. Also much concern about the future of wildlife management, deer herds, deer hunting, but all of wildlife management for the reasons we talked about earlier, that deer are so vital to our entire hunting industry and our other wildlife management programs. So the CWD, the end of deer hunting? Well, you know what? I'm an optimist. So I'm going to say no, it's not. But we absolutely have to be vigilant to minimize transmission in existing areas where we have it, prevent introduction of CWD into new areas, and absolutely support research and the Pennsylvania Game Commission's efforts with this disease, because only with our hunters working strongly and in partnership with our agency have we have any chance at all to beat this disease. At our website, deerassociation.com, we actually have a recommended practices for deer hunters. This talks about what they can do from a habitat end, from a deer harvest end, from a deer monitoring end. This is a free download. I strongly encourage you to go and grab it. It'll give you a little more information about this disease and what you can do to help. And then, because I firmly believe that as hunters, we certainly can help, and we absolutely need to engage in this fight and help if we're going to beat it. So this is my last slide. This is my email address here. Please, we're going to do a Q&A tonight, but when we're done here, feel free to email me anytime. I'm glad to answer questions relative to deer or habitat, CWD, or anything else. Appreciate your attention tonight. Thank you for joining here. And next up is Andrea to show you now with all of this exactly what the Game Commission is doing to help us protect this and safeguard this resource for the future. Thank you, Matt.
Thanks, Kip. You're clearly passionate about it and are a great pep talker for hunters in the state of Pennsylvania. Next up, as Kip mentioned, we have Andrea Corman, the CWD coordinator with Pennsylvania Game Commission. And Andrea is going to tell us a little bit about what PGC is doing about CWD management. So Andrea, the floor is yours.
Okay, thanks, Matt. Let me go ahead and share my screen here. Okay, can you see it?
Yep, looks good to me.
Okay, perfect. All right, well, good evening, everybody. So to start us off, I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of CWD in Pennsylvania. So CWD surveillance in Pennsylvania has been ongoing since 1998. And as of today, over 107,000 deer and nearly 1,600 elk have been tested for CWD. In 2003, the first Pennsylvania interagency CWD response plan was developed by agencies like the Game Commission, Pennsylvania Department of Ag, and USDA, and many others. This was also the beginning of our statewide sampling, where previously only clinical suspects were tested for CWD. In 2006, authority over the captive cervid industry was transferred from the Game Commission to Pennsylvania Department of Ag. So in Pennsylvania, CWD is actually managed under two different agencies, which can be challenging. Then in 2012, we had our first detections of CWD in Pennsylvania. And in July of last year, our agency response plan was approved by our Board of Commissioners, and we began implementing it that fall. Now, going back to our first detections, in October 2012, CWD was detected in a captive cervid facility, represented by a yellow star on this map in Adams County, which resulted in the creation of Disease Management Area, or DMA-1. And that facility was depopulated. And then just about 2 months later, 3 hunter-harvested free-ranging deer, represented by the red dots on the map, tested positive in Blair and Bedford counties, which resulted in the establishment of DMA-2. Now, given the distance, these events are not necessarily related, so it's hard to say exactly how CWD got into Pennsylvania. Then DMA-3 was created in 2014 after CWD was detected in 2 captive facilities in Jefferson County. And then in 2017, DMA1 was actually dissolved because it went 5 consecutive years without any additional CWD detections. Then in 2018, DMA4 was created after CWD was detected in a captive cervid facility in Lancaster County. So within DMAs, there is a ban on removing high-risk parts, feeding deer, and using urine-based attractants. Now, even with these restrictions in place and increased surveillance, DMAs have continued to expand and more deer test positive each year. If the trajectory of the disease increases in Pennsylvania like it has in other states, the infection rate in that portion of Blair, Bedford, and Fulton counties will likely exceed 30% in the next 10 to 20 years and will continue to spread throughout the state. Now, the revised and updated response plan establishes a framework for managing CWD in Pennsylvania. Currently, the best management strategy to control CWD is to reduce deer abundance in infected areas to slow the rate of disease transmission and remove infected individuals from the landscape. Many of the strategies in the plan focus on ways to limit spread of the disease and prevent it from becoming established in new areas. So the response plan identifies 4 different types of management areas. So we have disease management areas, or DMAs, the established area, enhanced surveillance units, and containment zones. And each of those is associated with different objectives and strategies that I'll talk about. So these are our current DMAs, and a DMA is created when new CWD detections are found in either free-ranging or captive deer, regardless of proximity to any previous detections. A 10-mile buffer is placed around each detection. 10 miles is used because it encompasses the dispersal distances of most deer in Pennsylvania, and it includes the area where a positive deer may have been spreading those prions. Now, depending on the location of the detection, it might have no effect. It could result in the expansion of an existing DMA, or it can also cause a new DMA to be created. So the purpose of a DMA is to reduce human-assisted spread of CWD. Sampling is increased to detect CWD spread from known locations, and feeding deer is prohibited, along with the use of natural urine-based attractants. Both of these can cause increased congregation of deer and can therefore increase transmission of the disease. High-risk parts also cannot be taken outside the DMA. And I'll define high-risk parts more a little bit later, but generally we're talking about the brain and the spinal column. We also increased antlerless allocations in wildlife management units that have had CWD detections in order to reduce deer abundance and limit spread of the disease. And head collection bins are also provided for hunters to submit heads for testing to increase our sampling and surveillance. So next is the established area, and we currently only have one, and it is within DMA2. Now, an established area is characterized by CWD detections that occur contiguously across a large area and consistently from year to year. In an established area, CWD is considered established within the deer population, and coupled with environmental contamination poses a long-term threat to neighboring areas. So this area covers primarily Blair, Bedford, and Fulton counties, or in terms of wildlife management units, we're looking at 4A and a portion of 2C. And over 90% of our positives have come from this area. So in an established area, the extent of the CWD infection is more significant than in other areas. So the goal here is to maintain sample prevalence at or below 5% and minimize the movement of high-risk parts to other areas. So 5% was chosen because data from other states and models show once that threshold is crossed, disease prevalence accelerates drastically making management of the disease even more difficult. So to reach this goal, reducing deer abundance is the primary management strategy for this area. Now, this is done through increased hunter harvests and helps reduce the potential for disease transmission and removes additional positive deer from the landscape. Due to the degree of this infection in this area, transport of high-risk parts outside of the established area is prohibited. So that's a new regulation for this year. Other DMA restrictions also apply here, so there's no feeding deer or using urine-based attractants either. So I mentioned the goal of 5% or less for sample prevalence. Now, based on hunter harvested adult deer, our sample prevalence in the established area has been above 5% since the 2018 season and is now actually close to 14%. So it's clear that there is a significant problem in the established area. Next, we have what we call enhanced surveillance units, or ESUs. These are individual areas within DMAs that are created when there is a new CWD detection, again, in either a free-ranging or captive deer, that is greater than 5 miles from any other past detection. Now, an ESU is created by using an approximately 3 to 5 mile radius buffer around an isolated detection. This buffer was chosen to balance the need to focus surveillance efforts in the area where an infected deer was likely to have traveled and still be able to collect enough samples to meet the target sample size. So in these new areas, the extent and sample prevalence of CWD are unknown. And each enhanced surveillance unit has an associated DMAP unit. So to the public, this looks and functions just like any other DMAP unit. So those small areas highlighted in pink on the map are the 8 that we created last year. The purpose of an ESU is to determine the extent and sample prevalence of CWD through increased sampling. Now, this is primarily achieved through increased hunter harvest. The target sample size for each unit is approximately 250 to 300 deer, so that'll give us an adequate confidence that we would detect the disease if it is in a small percentage of the population within that ESU. Hunters can also purchase up to 2 additional antlerless tags per unit to help us meet those sample goals. So last year, hunter participation was relatively good, with all but 1 unit selling at least 50% or more of available permits. We also exceeded our target sample size in 4 of those units. Now, in the units where we did not reach the 250 samples, we still received really good numbers, and the samples from those units are still informative. And last but not least, we have our containment zones, which are the smallest geographic areas consisting of an approximately 1 mile radius buffer around the location of a new CWD detection. So this size is based on a deer's average home range, and it includes the individuals it was most likely to come in contact with and potentially infect. So this area represents our best option to suppress the impact of an initial CWD detection. Now, this is just an example map with a hypothetical enhanced surveillance unit and containment zone, so you can see just how small a containment zone really is. So the purpose of a containment zone is to prevent the establishment and spread of CWD by removing the most high-risk deer from the area immediately surrounding a CWD detection. Management strategies in these areas might include increased hunter harvest and targeted removals to ensure that the deer most likely to have come in contact with that positive detection are removed. Given the small scale of these areas, communication and outreach to landowners for hunting access also occurs as a regular part of the process. And targeted removals do not occur unless we have permission from the landowner. So moving on to some of the other management strategies we have in place. We already know it's unlawful to remove or export high-risk cervid parts from a DMA or the established area. It is also unlawful to import these parts from any state or province outside Pennsylvania. That is also a new regulation for this year. So high-risk parts include the head, more specifically the brain, eyes, lymph nodes, and tonsils, along with the spinal cord and the spleen. Now, these parts are considered high risk because prions concentrate in high densities in these locations. And the importance of these regulations is to prevent people from dumping high-risk parts on the landscape in uninfected areas, possibly contaminating the soil in that area or exposing healthy deer or elk to the disease. Now, I've mentioned reducing deer numbers to slow the rate of disease transmission and to remove diseased individuals from the landscape. So how exactly do we go about doing that? The best way is to increase hunter harvest and in very specific situations, use targeted removals. We can and have increased hunter harvest in several ways. So we can increase the antlerless harvest at the wildlife management unit scale through antlerless license allocations or at a smaller scale using DMAP permits in those enhanced surveillance units I talked about. Concurrent firearm seasons also give hunters more flexibility to use these opportunities. And successful management of CWD cannot occur without our hunters. Their cooperation is essential, and removing those barriers to participation, like limited time to hunt, is one way to do this. Targeted removals are an option in certain areas with specific objectives. So these, again, are very small scale operations. They are carried out by wildlife professionals from USDA Wildlife Services, and they only occur post-hunting season. And these efforts are heavily dependent on landowner participation, as removals, again, only occur on properties where access has been permitted. Our surveillance efforts are also critical in detecting new cases of CWD and tracking the spread and sample prevalence of the disease. Now, in addition to testing white-tailed deer, we do test elk as well, and nearly all hunter harvested elk are tested, along with roadkill and clinical suspect elk. So far, no elk has tested positive, and no deer from within the elk management area have tested positive. But we have had over 700 CWD positive deer since it was first detected in 2012. For deer, we collect samples through a variety of methods, including hunter harvest from voluntary samples from head collection bins, which are only located within DMAs, as well as hunter harvest samples collected from meat processors statewide. Contractors are also employed to collect roadkill deer from state and local roads within and around the perimeter of DMAs. And those are probably our most important samples. They are often our first indication that the disease is expanding into new areas. And clinical suspects are also collected statewide. So to help the public stay current with our sampling efforts, we have a new dashboard that you can access from our main CWD page under CWD test results and surveillance data. So it allows you to see our most up-to-date sampling data and consists of 3 different pages. So there's samples over time, sample prevalence, and sample statistics. And the sample prevalence page you see here contains a series of filters and maps to provide information at different scales. We are also actually working with Department of Ag to develop one showing information for the captive industry, and that should be available to the public relatively soon. As part of the Game Commission's efforts to effectively manage CWD and other wildlife diseases, the Wildlife Futures Program was started in 2019. And Wildlife Futures is a partnership between the Game Commission and the University of Pennsylvania's School of Veterinary Medicine. So this program actually combines wildlife disease expertise and research from Penn Vet with the Game Commission's commitment to protecting, managing, and promoting wildlife in Pennsylvania. So Wildlife Futures has a CWD diagnostic lab that provides 2 different types of testing, including a more rapid test that has helped us improve turnaround time. So in other words, we can notify a hunter of their deer's test results within days rather than weeks. And some of the CWD research they're doing includes work to develop a rapid field test for CWD using biomarkers from infected deer, and development of procedures where dogs are actually trained to detect CWD in deer feces. So for more information on their research and other services, you can visit the Wildlife Futures website at this link. And we also actually have this phone number and email available for the public to use for any CWD related questions they might have. So that's all I have. Thank you all very much. And Matt, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you very much, Andrea. Okay, folks, so we're at the end of the formal presentations. If you have questions, please submit those into the Q&A. We actually have 4 waiting for us, so I'll start addressing those. As a reminder, this was recorded, so if you missed anything and you want to go back and view it, we are posting all of the regional meetings on the National Deer Association YouTube channel. So you can just go to deerassociation.com and you can look up our YouTube channel, and they're being posted there pretty quickly. So we have some questions, and I'll address either the entire panel or the person if they're named in the question. And don't forget, beyond Roger Kaup from Northwest Region, Brian Richards with the National Wildlife Health Center, Kip Adams with the NDA, and Andrea, who you just heard from with PGC. We also have Scott Weber with Wildlife Futures and UPenn or Penn Vet. Okay, so the first question was specifically for Roger. Roger, the question says, why are you not depopulating the areas around where you have positives? Could you please turn off your turn off mute and turn on your microphone and answer that question?
Yeah, that's a good question. And one of the things Andrea pointed out, when we try to remove deer around a positive, we want to work with landowners, get landowner permission. And sometimes that's not always an easy proposition to get the permission we need in a timely fashion to do the removal. As she said, we've tried to implement the DMAP in some of those areas to increase the harvest, but when the DMAP includes private property like that, the landowners still have to give permission for hunters to come on their property and harvest the deer. So in many cases, it's often just a matter of getting the proper landowner permissions to do that extra removal.
Just to kind of add to that, even in areas where we do get permission, the deer figure it out pretty quick. So you might have access to a couple of properties to, take some deer in a certain area, but after a few tries, they move across the street onto the next fence line, and they'll stand there and just say, you don't have access over here and you can't get me. And so there's no way that we could ever completely depopulate an area, even if we wanted to.
Great additional information. Thank you, Roger and Andrea. The next question says, CWD has existed in Colorado for over 20 years and deer populations have not suffered much, and the University of Texas has determined that certain gene types are immune to the disease. So why are you saying it will greatly reduce populations? I think that's a good one for Brian to answer. So immunity is part of the question, and also population reductions.
Got it. I can read the question as well. Thank you. So the question says CWD has existed in Colorado for over 20 years. Actually, it's over 40 years, probably longer than that. Deer populations have not suffered much. So focus on that qualifier much. I guess that's a subjective idea. In the peer-reviewed literature, CWD has been documented to be the cause behind localized population decline in mule deer, white-tailed deer, and elk populations in the states of Colorado and Wyoming. So I guess it all comes down to that qualifier of much. I go back to individual areas. I know landowners, I know hunters in the core area in Wisconsin where they're not seeing the deer they used to. They haven't seen a male over 3.5 years of age in 5, 6, 7 years. And nearly every deer they and their family members shoot on those properties test CWD positive. And they look at deer no longer as that valued resource, but as this, why do we do this? Why do we even want deer on the landscape when this disease is present in those types of volumes? So I guess it comes down to that qualifier. Have they not suffered much? I think it depends on where you are. The second part of the question is research at University of Texas determined that certain gene types are immune. So I'm not aware of any genotype which has been shown to date to be 100% resistant to CWD. There's naturally occurring genotypes of deer, in most populations, a smaller subset of the population that has an incubation period of CWD that's something on the terms of 5 years instead of that garden variety deer where the incubation period is 2 years. So if you are that deer with that incubation period of 5 years, that's great for you and your offspring if you breed true to that genetic line. But you're a worst case scenario for the garden variety deer who have that 2-year incubation period. Because even if you alone survive with that disease for up to 5 years, it's likely you're shedding infectious agent out into the environment and directly transmitting CWD to other more susceptible members of the deer herd. So we would refer to that as a typhoid Mary syndrome, where you yourself may not be impacted that greatly by disease, but you're the worst case scenario for other members around you. Complete that thought with, even if we were able to, develop genotypes that truly are 100% resistant, that might make a big impact in the captive deer industry. But how do we get those animals out there on the landscape? We can introduce individual deer from genotypes out into the landscape, but they breed like and their offspring look like every other deer out there. So how do we protect members of that resistant genotype if we could develop it and if we could figure out a mechanism to successfully inject that genotype into the wild deer population? I'll leave it with that. Thank you.
Thanks, Brian. Does anybody else want to add anything to that?
Matt, I'll add one thing to that. I agree with everything that Brian just said. And I think it's important for some folks to know too, is that some things that work well in captivity or help the captive industry aren't necessarily good for wild deer. And this whole genotype discussion with a little more immunity is a great one. And
Looks like Kip is freezing,
they
so
can't survive the fence. Mother Nature weeds that out in a hurry.
all right. Thanks, Kip. You were on my end anyway, you were freezing a little bit. I'm not sure if that's going to come through in the recording. All right, next question for the panel. Next question. Deer urine can contain the prions, so why is it still legal to use deer urine as a lure that can spread the prions to all areas in the state? I don't know if Andrea wants to start with that, and then if anybody else would like to respond.
Sure. So kind of like I said in my talk, it's actually not legal to use deer urine attractants in disease management areas. And, aside from it potentially containing prions, it does cause additional congregation of deer. And we don't want that additional contact between individuals because it does increase transmission. So we do have that as a regulation in the state. It's not statewide, but it is within our disease management areas.
Thanks, Andrea. Anybody else want to respond to that?
I might be able to add a bit if you'll humor me, Matt.
Sure.
So the prion burden in urine is relatively low compared to, say, brain of a clinically affected animal. So relatively low. And with testing protocols that can be put in place, we can really minimize the risk that an individual bottle of deer urine contains enough prions to truly cause infection. With that being said, I'll go right back to what Andrea identified. Whether it's a urine-based lure or a synthetic lure or corn or whatever the case may be, what these are designed to do is to aggregate deer in space and time. And so if any deer in that geographic area has CWD, you're increasing the transmission risk by artificially congregating those animals. And that to me is a much bigger impact than the threat of an individual bottle of lure that one hunter has in their pocket spreading CWD. It's the aggregation risk, the amplification risk, which is truly the biggest concern, at least in my opinion.
Thanks, Brian. Either the same person or somebody else followed that up with a new response. So why is it not statewide? So I think the person is in favor of it not being used in the state, even if it's not in a DMA.
So that is something that we recommended in our response plan. And it has not been put into regulation yet, but it is something that we will likely continue to pursue. But in the meantime, we do still, if somebody asks us, we recommend that you don't use those natural urine lures and that instead you might use something synthetic to avoid, the potential for prions to be in there. But ultimately, we recommend not using it at all because it can cause increased congregation of deer. And, we actually did a hunter survey a few years ago, and it showed that, using those attractants actually doesn't increase hunter success. So we recommend not using them at all.
Thanks, Andrea. Anybody else on that issue before we move on to the next one, which is minerals? The last question I see in the Q&A is, are mineral supplements considered feeding deer? This person is located in Indiana County.
So yes, if you're referring to those mineral licks and salt licks, that is still considered feeding because it does still cause deer to come into a congregated environment. And I think Kip kind of mentioned it in his talk that, one deer licks it and then 10 deer lick it, and then all those deer could potentially get it if that first one was infected. And so that is a big part of why those are basically illegal to use in disease management areas.
Thanks, Andrea. I'm not seeing any more questions in the Q&A. So we'll just wait here a few seconds to see if any pop in. But again, these were recorded, or this session was recorded. If you're interested in seeing where, go to the Deer Association website. And as I'm not seeing any other questions pop in, I want to first thank the entire panel and the speakers for taking time out tonight to provide really accurate and up-to-date information that's science-based about chronic wasting disease. And especially thanks to the participants for joining us tonight, taking time out of your busy schedules to learn a little bit more about CWD and deer and the importance of this issue in the Commonwealth. Without seeing any other questions, I'd like to thank everybody and wish you all a good night. And we'll end the recording now. So everybody have a good evening and hopefully have a good and safe season this upcoming fall if you're a deer hunter. Good night.